Drones are coming to the United States. They are already in use for surveillance capabilities in numerous American cities by numerous local police departments. It is inevitable that they will spread not just for surveillance, but also for weaponized purposes. You see this importation of what was once something we could convince ourselves was confined to foreign soil, increasingly into domestic soil, and finding ways to convince our fellow citizens that we all have an equal stake in combating these abridgments is, in my view, of the highest priority in terms of combating them. Earlier, there was a speaker who was an official with the electric union, John Woodruff, who spoke, and I wish everyone could hear what he said, not just in this room, but everywhere, because he talked about how civil liberties abridgments are a core issue for the labor movement. And the reason that he gave was that any organization that wants to agitate against those in power has an equal stake in protecting these liberties, is equally endangered when they're assaulted. That's true not just of the labor movement, but of every single political activist group that is trying to accomplish change in the United States. That is what civil liberties is about. It's why an abridgment for one person is abridgment for everyone. The third reason that I think it's so difficult to combat these things and has been so hard, and the reason why we've been allowing it to happen, is because the role that partisan allegiance plays in all of this. Professor Aziz talked about the fear-mongering campaign that has been incredibly effective, but so too is the role that partisan loyalty has. There's this incredible report, which you can find online, which I would urge you to go read. It's a 2008 report that was prepared by the CIA at the height of the general election between John McCain and Barack Obama. And what prompted the CIA report, that was written in secret and ultimately leaked to WikiLeaks, which published it, was the concern that anti-war sentiment was spreading in Western Europe, and it had actually caused the fall of two Western European governments that were supportive of the war in Afghanistan, and the CIA was petrified that if this anti-war sentiment continued to spread, it would compel the withdrawal of troops from every government in Western Europe, and ultimately it would spread to the United States. And what this report concluded was that the only real weapon against the spreading anti-war sentiment, the only tool that could really be a good, effective antidote, would be the election of Barack Obama. And the reason, said the CIA report, why that would happen was because if Obama was elected, it would replace, as the face of American wars, this swaggering evangelical cowboy that the world had come to hate, and replace it with a much softer, more sophisticated, educated, urbane, progressive constitutional lawyer that would then transform huge numbers of war opponents into people who view these wars as humanitarian. And that CIA report was incredibly prescient, not just in terms of being able to sustain support for American militarism, but also to ensure that even greater amounts of support for this rights assault was prevalent in the United States. And I know this from my own experience. I've been speaking about civil liberties now in the United States for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. And if I spoke 4 or 5 years ago to a room like this, and you just assembled 100 people randomly from the street, and I stood up and I denounced all the policies that I've just denounced, and I talked about the civil liberties issues I've just spoken about, you would have half of that room of randomly assembled Americans 4 years ago extremely antagonistic to what I was saying, completely hating me. Those were called Republicans. Because they were very supportive of these policies because they were George Bush and Dick Cheney's policies, but you would have 50% of the room thinking exactly the opposite way. They'd be boisterously cheering me, saying that I was defending everything that was sacred about America, I was defending American values, fighting against right-wing radicalism. Those were called Democrats. So you have this incredibly divisive citizenry surrounding these issues. 40 years later, if you assemble that same audience, and I stand up and I speak about the same exact policies in the same exact way, you'll have 85% of that room hating me, 80% if I'm lucky, and 15 to 20% of the room being supported because huge numbers of Democrats have now become supportive of the very policies that 4 years ago they were denouncing as right-wing radicalism because it's now a Democratic policy. Just to illustrate this point in a very visceral way, think about what the real controversies were of the Bush administration that caused huge numbers of Democrats and progressives and even American liberals to run around shrieking about the war that was being waged on the Constitution. It was things like the president's asserted authority to eavesdrop on our conversation without judicial review, or even to detain people without charges. Those kind of controversies almost seem quaint at this point, given that we now have a president who decrees the right not simply to eavesdrop on our conversations without warrants, though he does do that, or to simply detain people without charges, though he does that as well, but who actually signed into law a bill that codified that power of indefinite detention permanently, and who claims the right not simply to eavesdrop on us or to detain us without judicial review, but to target us for assassination. A power that he not only claims in theory, but has exercised in practice when he killed the American Yemeni cleric Anwar al-Awlaki by a CIA drone, and then 2 weeks later killed his 16-year-old American-born son, Abdul Rahman, despite no evidence of any wrongdoing. And yet the same people who were so vitriolic 4 years ago about more tepid civil rights abridgments under George Bush are, for the most part, relatively silent and quiet, because there's no longer partisan opportunism to be had from objecting to these issues. And that, too, is a critical impediment to what makes these issues so difficult to fight against. Now, the last issue I want to raise about what I think the impediments are, and then I want to just move on briefly to talk about the implications and what can be done, is the way in which radicalism in the United States becomes normalized so quickly. This was something that really got underscored for me very viscerally. I just want to share this personal anecdote. About a year ago, I went and I spoke at a university in Indiana, at Purdue University. And I spoke about civil liberties abridgments in the United States, and there were 3 or 4 high school students from Kentucky who drove several hours to come in here and speak, and afterwards they interviewed me, and they actually, although it was ostensibly supposed to be an interview, the things they said to me have stuck with me much more than I think the things I said to them stuck with them. And one of the things this young lady said, who was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school, she said, look, you keep talking about and writing about the way in which our society has changed so radically in the aftermath of 9/11, all of these liberties that have been lost. But she said, you know, for people who are my age, I'm 15, I was 4 years old at the time of 9/11, there really is no such thing as a pre-9/11 and a post-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is the totality of their political consciousness. What seems extremist to people who witness the transformation has become very quickly normalized for increasing numbers of people, and as every year goes by, more and more people are trained to view it as the normal state of affairs, as something that they, with the idea of fighting against it, would not even occur to them. And that's true not just in terms of these legal issues, but the way we think about Muslims, the way we think about our fellow citizens, the powers that we think the government should have in terms of doing whatever it wants. Each day that goes by that we allow this to linger, the more difficult it is to combat it. So I just want to close by talking about what I think is the biggest implication of this, and really the primary reason why I work on these issues as much as I do, and why I think it's so urgent to get other people to work on them and band together and fight them as well. There are all kinds of implications that we could spend the rest of the day talking about, from allowing the government to punish people for speech, or engaging in massive surveillance, or depriving people of core liberties without due process. Those are all critically important. But I think the really most significant implication is one that's a little bit more difficult to apprehend, but probably the most insidious, and it's this. When you allow the government to transgress the limits that we collectively have imposed on its power, what it really does is it fundamentally alters the relationship between the citizenry and the government. So in a free society, the ideal state is that those who wield political power have a healthy fear of those over whom they exercise their power. They fear what will happen if power is abused. But in a tyranny, by definition, this is true of every tyranny on the planet, those who are citizens fear their own government. They fear the people over whom power is exercised. And the reason for that is because they know that there are no limits to what the government can do to them, because those limits are so easily ignored. And I just want to share, to close, a personal anecdote, again, that underscored for me that theory, but in a very visceral and emotional way that has really stuck with me and shaped so much of how I think about these things. This took place in January of 2010. January 2010 was the first time that I ever wrote about the organization WikiLeaks. I've written a lot about them in the last 2 years. I've written lots of in defense, but this was the first time I had ever written about them. And in January 2010, almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they had done any of their really big news-making leaks. And the way that I came to learn about WikiLeaks was that in 2008, the Pentagon had prepared a top-secret report. And in this report, it decreed WikiLeaks to be an enemy of the state. It said WikiLeaks posed a grave threat to the national security of the United States, and it plotted all sorts of ways to destroy WikiLeaks. And ironically enough, this top-secret report got leaked to WikiLeaks, which then published it on its website. And the New York Times wrote this very short article about it, about how this strange, obscure transparency group had been decreed to be an enemy of the state by the Pentagon, and the Pentagon was preparing to destroy it. And I just, by accident, stumbled into this short New York Times article, and I remember after I read it thinking, you know, look, any group that has been decreed to be an enemy of the state by the Pentagon and that the Pentagon is actively plotting to destroy is a group that merits a lot more attention and probably a whole bunch of support. And so I went and I researched WikiLeaks, and I saw that they had done all sorts of amazing transparency projects all throughout the world, and I wrote a long article about the promise that I thought this transparency model held for bringing transparency to the national security state. And I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and posted the interview. And at the end of that article, I encouraged people to go and donate money to WikiLeaks. And I gave links to how they could do that through PayPal, by Bankwire, to donate money electronically to WikiLeaks. Because I knew that they had budgetary constraints, they were sitting on lots of big secrets, but they couldn't process them. And so I encouraged people to donate. And in response to that article, I had huge numbers of people, dozens and dozens of people, in all kinds of venues, in the comment section for that article, by email to me, at events like this, basically say something to me along the lines of, you know, look, I completely understand what you're saying about WikiLeaks. I understand why you want to be supportive of it. I want to donate money to WikiLeaks. But my problem is that I'm actually afraid that if I do so, if I send the money electronically, I'm going to end up on a government list somewhere. Or even worse, can be subjected to criminal liability for materially supporting a terrorist organization. And these were not crazy, irrational people prone to conspiracy theories and wild speculation. Believe me, I can recognize people easily like that from lots of interaction. These were very sober, rational people who were petrified of their own government, who had relinquished their own rights voluntarily because their government had signaled to them that there was nothing they couldn't do to them, no matter what the Constitution said. And the reason why that struck me so profoundly is because you can offer all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. But if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry out of exercising those rights by signaling to them that those who wield power can do so without limits, those rights become completely worthless. And it's actually a more effective form of tyranny than overtly denying the rights, because people who are paralyzed that way by fear can simply convince themselves that they're not being deprived of anything. Rosa Luxemburg, the socialist activist, said once that he who does not move does not notice his chains. He who does not move does not notice his chains. It's very easy to intimidate people into paralysis while convincing them that they're free. And that, to me, is the state of affairs that has arisen in the United States from this climate of fear that comes from allowing these civil liberties abridgments to take place. So the last thing I want to leave you with, because I'm out of time, and I just want to leave you with this briefly, is, you know, it's possible that if you gather together at a conference like this and you talk about all the formidable injustices that are arising and all the strong and powerful forces behind it, there's this danger that you can sort of spread this kind of gloominess, you know, like, oh my God, I just listened to all these people talk about all these horrible rights abridgments, and I think I want to go hide under my bed or throw myself off a bridge or something. And the reason why it's so important not to think that way, and it's why it's important for, I think, everyone to think about not just what's wrong, but also what can be done about it, is because if there's any lesson that we should be able to learn from recent history or past history, it's that that kind of defeatism is completely ill-advised.